In the dank and dismal back streets of London, there once lived a parson who loved to play cards. He practiced every day, and there wasn't a game he couldn't master. The parson neglected his duties at the church because he would rather play poker than say his prayers. At first, he just played against his friends for fun, but one day he suggested that they play for pennies in order to make the games more exciting. His friends agreed, and naturally, the parson won. His friends wanted the chance to win their money back, and so they played more games for higher and higher stakes. No matter how hard his friends tried to beat him, the parson always ended up as the winner. Then the day finally arrived when his friends refused to play him anymore. "You should challenge professional gamblers," they said. "You're good enough." The parson took his friends at their word and sought out the company of hardened gamblers in the low dives of Seven Dials. In the beginning, these men thought the parson would be easy pickings, but they were shocked at the skill with which he played. His fingers could make the cards dance when he shuffled the pack, and he thought nothing of risking a fortune on the turn of a single card. His reputation spread like wildfire, and people travelled from all over Europe to challenge him. But it seemed that Lady Luck was in love with the reckless parson, for he never lost. However, the parson was not really interested in the money. He craved the thrill of winning. At last, even the professional gamblers refused to sit down to a game with him. "No one can get the better of you," they complained bitterly. "You won't be happy until you've ruined us all." So the parson was reduced to disguising himself and visiting the inns and taverns of London, where he tricked unsuspecting customers into playing games of chance with him. He would watch the men playing and then say that their game looked good fun. When they asked him if he wanted to join them, he would smile innocently and say that he had never played before, but that if they didn't mind, he would love to. Then he would proceed to fleece them of every penny they possessed. Soon the word of his trickery spread all over the city until there remained not a single tavern where he was welcome. And no matter how cleverly he changed his appearance, his magic fingers gave him away the second they touched the pack. There was no one in the whole of London who was such a master of the cards, and the parson found himself banned from all the places where people gathered to enjoy a game. The parson was absolutely miserable that no one would play against him anymore. He cared nothing for the fact that a terrible plague was raging in the rookery of St. Giles, and his duty demanded that he visit the sick and the dying to comfort and pray for them. Bodies were being piled up inside his church, but the parson had no interest in conducting the burial services. All he wanted was someone to challenge his skill at cards. He could think of nothing else. One stormy night, the parson sat alone in his room playing patience. Suddenly, he leapt to his feet and shouted, "No, this won't do. I will not play against myself. I am the greatest card player in the world, but I need new opponents who are worthy of me." Then his face lit up, and he muttered to himself, I think I know where I can find them." So saying, he grabbed his candle lantern and swept out of his lonely room. He stamped across the graveyard and marched into the church. He placed his lantern down on an empty coffin, pulled out a deck of cards, and said to the corpses lying on the floor, "The living won't play me, lads, but surely you are not afraid to give me a game. After all, what have you got left to lose?" The candle flame guttered and flared, and the stone floor of the old church creaked and cracked as three of the corpses slowly sat up and climbed unsteadily to their feet. They shuffled over to the parson and sat down next to the coffin. A strange blue light glowed in their eyes. "We will play you, parson," said one of the dead in a raw, harsh voice, "but not for money." "If not for money, then what?" asked the parson. "We will play for your life," answered the corpse. The parson grinned happily. "At last, a game worth playing and a stake worth playing for," he said. But I must warn you, my friends, that I never lose, and I have no intention of losing tonight." The three dead men looked coldly at the confident parson. "Deal the cards," was all they said. The parson and the corpses played all through the night. Sometimes it seemed as if the dead men were winning, and sometimes the parson appeared to have the upper hand. Then, finally, just before the cock crowed for dawn, only the parson and one corpse were left playing. "The time has come, parson," said the corpse, "to see whether you live or die. Show me your cards." "Fair enough," replied the parson. "I have a terrific hand, 3 kings and 2 queens. That's a full house and nearly unbeatable." The dead man said nothing, but just stared at the parson. The eerie blue light in his eyes burned very brightly. The parson swallowed hard. "What cards do you hold?" he asked nervously. "I have 2 pairs," said the sinister figure. The parson gave a huge sigh of relief. Then his usual proud expression returned. "Then I'm afraid I win," he said smugly. "A full house beats 2 pairs. He stood up and turned to leave. "But you haven't seen my cards yet," said the corpse. The parson turned back and said, "All right, my friend, if you insist. Show me your cards." "Well," whispered the dead man, "I have 1 pair of aces and another pair of aces." "But that's 4 aces!" screamed the horrified parson. "Yes," agreed the corpse. "So you lose." The parson gasped with horror and then fell lifelessly to the floor. When the good people of the parish came to church later that morning to say their prayers, they discovered the body of the parson, but, try as they might, they could not prise the cards from his cold, dead fingers.
The darkness was like the bottom of a sack. The cold winter rain was like a deluge. Streetlights had failed. John McConkie's hands gripped the steering wheel of his 40-ton Isuzu truck, packed with over 100,000 large eggs, picked up earlier in the afternoon from a battery farm near Louth in Lincolnshire. The job had started off perfectly normally, although he'd got there late and the loaders had been slow. He'd managed to leave Louth by 2 p.m. though, and it roared off, engine growling, eggs firmly swaddled, radio blaring out cheap pop music. But the traffic was soon surprisingly heavy. He hadn't intended to stop till he'd got to the depot in Croydon, but it had been a tiring day, and he pulled into the services at Birchanger Green. 1 plate of something ambitiously called an all-day breakfast, and a couple of rollies with tepid tea on the rotting bench overlooking the car park, and he climbed wearily back into the cab, tapping at the tablet on the passenger seat, which sprang into life with a picture of Alice and his 11-month-old Archie, and turning to look out of the windscreen at the greying sky, McConkie turned the key. Other than a clicking sound, nothing. Tried again, nothing. Bloody Pete. He'd been told about the dodgy starter motor before. Said he'd looked at it. Had he buggery. The RAC guy took nearly 2 hours to get to him, but at least he managed to get it going. 3 hours later, the Isuzu was encased in rainwater and darkness, stationary on the side of the road somewhere in South London. The sat-nav was defunct. Thanks, Pete. McConkie's mobile was dead, and he'd forgotten the charger. And he had not an idea about where he was. He was exhausted and now angry with himself and with the world. Jumping up and down on his seat, he began to beat his fists on the steering wheel, swearing at the top of his voice. Breathing heavily, he threw himself back in the seat and then screamed. The sound was quickly absorbed by the fur lining his cab and the rain sluicing down in the darkness outside. He turned the ignition key. It started. Thank Christ. Looking in his mirror, McConkie pulled out into the road and accelerated. The lack of streetlights, what's happened to the fucking streetlights, confused him, and he suddenly realised he was driving on a very narrow road with empty heathland stretching all around. Where the fuck was he? And where were all the other vehicles? There was nothing to be seen, apart from the lights of distant buildings. And then, in an instant, he was falling. Well, the truck was falling with him in it. It could only have been half a second, and there was an almighty jolt, and the truck came to an abrupt halt with the grinding noise of folding metal. He had surged forward, of course, but the seatbelt had yanked him back, and he lay there, totally nonplussed, breathing heavily, shock beginning to set in. He leant forward slowly to try to see where he was, and the truck gave a lurch and fell down, down, down. The lighting was subdued, a greenish tinge to the walls cast from the few cold strip lights and the odd bright spot of an overbed lamp glaring down at the scarcely moving occupant below. Red dots winked, screens shimmered with life, or with life draining away, drip by drip. John lay almost still, cables and tubes sustaining his breathing, connecting him to the fabric of the building, connecting him to the world. 2 nurses stood close by at the end of his bed, chatting absent-mindedly. The night shift created a sort of fog in their weary minds, from which they occasionally managed to emerge and meet, only for the swirling clouds to swallow them once more. One tall, skinny blonde stared down at McConkey's prone figure. "He's dead lucky, you know. PC Twatted told me his lorry fell about 50 or 60 foot. Bloody hell." Her smaller and rather more substantial companion stared off into space. Skinny Blonde continued, "He's not bad looking." "Twatted?" Substantial grinned. "You can't be serious." "No, him, John, what's his name, McConkey. It's a weird name, that, don't you think? Reminds me of a cock and a nose wrapped in a burger bun." She laughed at her own odd little fantasy. Her friend screwed up her face. "What are you on about?" "McConkey, it's obvious, no?" Skinny sighed melodramatically. "You have no imagination." "Well, yes, actually, I do, but it's not weird like yours." Neither spoke for a while. "Well, I'll tell you what is weird," Substantial broke in. "Look, you're dying to tell me something. Come on, just spit it out." Skinny gave a tiny smile and then looked comically serious. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Well, it was Twathead who was first at the bottom of the fucking great big hole this bloke's lorry had fallen into. Okay, there he is. He's been lowered on this harness down into this pit. He's seen the lorry, about to release the harness to go and see to the conky here, and he just shines his torch around to make sure they're okay and that the whole thing isn't about to collapse in on him. And what does he see?" Skinny seemed distracted for a moment and jerked her face away as an alarm went off somewhere in a distant ward. Footsteps sounded and disappeared, and she relaxed. Substantial was impatient now, though. "Go on! What did he see?" Skinny turned to look at her companion. Skulls. Thousands of them. Substantial's mouth rounded to an O. "Plague pits," whispered Skinny. "What?" Almost angrily, Skinny hissed, "The Black Death." John's right eye flickered. "Ow! Get this little bugger off me!" John McConkey pushed the kitten off his left knee, where it had started to hang upside down off the material of his trousers, using its needle claws to cling on. "Hey, Archie's listening, enough of the buggers," admonished his wife with a fake grimace of disapproval. "Alice, how could a 1-year-old be taking in a few random words, eh?" And before she could answer, he thrust up the palm of his hand towards her face to show he knew only too well how his wife would know about these things, and silenced the coming lecture. She gave him a resigned but forgiving glance. Changing the subject quickly, she asked the question she'd been asking relentlessly since his return from hospital. "John, why do you need to go back to work so soon? Can't you relax for a week more, even a few days more?" His reply was patient. but was showing signs of beginning to cross that line. "You know I can't afford to. I've been off for a fortnight now. We need the money. You want to be a proper mum to Archie, so I need to do the bacon thing." The topic was clearly one of long standing. Alice looked exasperated and picked Archie off her husband's lap with a touch of asperity. Exasperation surfaced rather too quickly. "Oh, okay, I know it's all my fault. We were doing well and then I stupidly," she hit the word harshly, "wanted to be a mother." At that, McConkey pushed to his feet and strode from the room. "John, I'm sorry. You know she faltered. "You know I want us to have a nice life and it's tough at the moment for you, for both of us. But it will get better. I'll be able to work soon and—" She hesitated, and in the hesitation, he rested his head on her shoulder and began to stroke her hair. They said nothing for a while as they held one another, gazing at the prone form of their sleeping son in the cot beside their bed, both remembering days not long past, but seemingly days from a lost age. Alice spoke hesitantly. "John, I know it's a blur and I know you want to forget it, but I've been talking to that constable, Mike Holbantz. He came round the other day with those papers he wanted you to sign, and he talked a bit about how he found you." No word came from her husband. She carried on fearlessly. "About what was down there, in that hole." Her voice faded to a whisper. John looked at her, his face hard to read. After a long 10 seconds or so, he spoke. His voice was strained, reedy, petulant. "We've been over this, I've told you. I can't remember a bloody thing." Involuntarily, he glanced over at his sleeping son, as if the heavily breathing toddler would be listening in to yet another word that would damn and blight him forever. "All I remember is ow! Fucking hell!" Alice sighed. The kitten had jumped up on John's left leg precipitately and then careered up to his shoulder. John had given it a bit of a real thump this time, sending the thing skittering over the wooden floor. "Go on." Eye sockets. Thousands of them. Shining somehow in the dark. John's voice grew tight, urgent. "I've tried to think back. I've tried, but there's one thing I just can't remember." He was agitated, and his voice raised in pitch and volume, strangulated, intense, anguished. "I can't remember, Alice." She cut to the chase. No time now for wheedling and soft talk. "What can't you remember?" she almost shouted. Whether the policeman's torch was on or off. He went back to work the next day. His workmates subjected him to the usual joshing, mostly involving jokes about scrambled eggs and nurses. His boss had put him on short trips, but still he struggled to get back to normality, his energy levels depleted. Everything felt difficult. A week later, he woke in the night, drenched in sweat. His body ached. He could hear Alice downstairs, microwaving Archie's milk. He called out feebly, "Alice!" The microwave dinged. He heard its door being opened, and he knew that Alice would now be shaking the bottle so that the milk would be squirting onto her outstretched hand. Archie began to whimper in his chair. McConkey called out again, entreaty in his voice, "Alice!" But hearing the lounge door open and close, the TV coming on, he knew it was pointless calling out again. His son would be sucking ferociously on his bottle, and Alice would be settled into a sleep-deprived trance as she gazed at the flickering screen. McConkey lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to control the rising panic in his body as a chill succeeded the high sweat. Staggering out of the bed, he managed to pull the 2 spare duvets out of the wardrobe. He got back in and pulled them haphazardly over his body, which was now shaking with fever. Day followed weary day, as McConkey's nights followed the same pattern. Chills and sweats, and a morning after of appalling exhaustion. Alice exhorted him to stay off work, told him he needed more rest. He hadn't got over the accident. Surely his boss would understand. But somehow each morning he managed to get dressed, drink a coffee, and take the bus to the depot, stroking his son's head and blowing his wife an air kiss. He was terrified of giving them what he had. At work, before his day began, he'd log on to the internet in the office and search hungrily through websites listing symptoms. Restlessly, he scrolled through a litany of disease: meningitis, seasonal flu, COVID-19, bilharzia, bubonic plague, heat stroke, malaria, dengue, Ebola, Lassa fever. It just went on and on. His mind ranged obsessively through his own symptoms, the overheard conversation, his fear of death, his love of his family and of his own life, conflating all into a tumour of misery and despair. But one disease caught in his febrile mind over and over. He knew he had to tell Alice, to tell her to go, to take Archie and run 1,000 miles away from him. Realising he was late for his first job, he hastily closed the myriad open windows on the PC, pushed back the chair and stood up abruptly. A sharp pain made him cry out. A sharp pain under his armpit. No, it couldn't be. He scrabbled at the buttons on his shirt, almost ripping them undone. He pressed convulsively and winced with the pain. It really was. There was a bubo under his arm. He knew it was impossible. It was medieval, but there it was, a real-life bubo. As he collapsed slowly onto the hard floor of the office, he saw the skulls, lit with a ghastly green glow, grin from the dull grey of the office walls. Again, the darkness of the ward at night. The same red lights winking, the screens flickering, the same whispered conversations drifting like marsh fogs through the noxious hospital air. John McConkie lying prone, but in a different bed. Laughter. Skinny. Apparently he actually thought he had the Black Death. Snickering from Substantial. Some people are so stupid. Why did you think that? Well, when Ant and Deck picked him up, they had to sedate him to get him into the ambulance. Deck told me he was shouting something about his body being rotten. There was a question mark here. And that he was going to be eaten by a plague of skulls. Again, the question mark. God knows what the bloke's been on, but they had to hold him down apparently to even get him in. Substantial gave a nervous giggle. So what's he really got? Oh, it's just cat scratch fever. Bloke wound himself up. Shows you shouldn't try to be your own doctor. Skinny snorted and was about to continue when, before either of them could say any more, a doctor appeared unseen at their side. Both stopped talking and gazed at him apprehensively. His soft-spoken, Far East-inflected voice held an undertone that afterwards neither nurse could quite identify. Please, stop gossiping. Bring John McConkie to Theatre 1B immediately. Following him with her eyes as he padded silently out of the main door of the wards, Skinny was afterwards certain that she heard him mutter something about an ill wind.